It's the autumn of 2004, and a Dell OptiPlex on an office desk has frozen for the third time since lunch. The user holds the power button, the fans spin up to a roar, and the little light just blinks amber. When the help desk calls back, they blame the warm room, a bad outlet, a recent Windows update, anything but the hardware. Across thousands of offices, the same machines are doing the same thing, but the real cause was already sitting inside the chassis. It was a microscopic hardware fault that started at the manufacturing level, entirely hidden from the people relying on those machines. Open that case under a flashlight and the story sits right there, near the processor socket. A row of small silver and black cylinders sits on the board, packed in tight beside the power circuits. These are electrolytic capacitors, and their job is plain. They smooth and steady the messy power coming off the supply so the chips get a clean, even feed, and on a healthy board, their metal tops sit perfectly flat. On this board, they don't. The tops have domed upward like little tins left too long on a stove, and a few have split along the scored lines cut into their caps. Out of those splits comes a dried, tea-colored crust, the residue of an electrolyte that boiled and forced its way out. A part that should have stayed invisible for a decade had turned itself inside out in about 2 years. That's what a technician would have seen if anyone had looked. Instead, the machine just acted haunted, rebooting on its own, freezing mid-task, dropping the video signal, or refusing to power on at all. The people who opened these cases knew exactly what those swollen cans meant. They often had to walk into a manager's office and argue that a brand new fleet was failing from the inside, while the support line kept insisting the room was simply too warm. This machine wasn't simply killed by the heat. It was dying from a chemical reaction that started before it ever left the factory, and it was nowhere near alone. What killed that board wasn't unique to Dell. Between roughly 1999 and 2007, electrolytic capacitors from a whole range of makers began failing years early, showing up as bulging cans on motherboards, power supplies, and televisions all over the world. Repair forums filled with the same photographs, the same domed tops, the same brown crust. In technical circles, the era picked up a name. People called it the capacitor plague. The popular explanation was industrial espionage. A scientist walked off with a water-based electrolyte recipe from a Japanese maker and handed an incomplete version to competitors. The copy left out the additives that kept the chemistry stable, so it gassed up and corroded from the inside. While the espionage rumor dominated forums, the reality was likely tied to intense cost pressure, rapid factory expansion, and an opaque supply chain. That distinction matters for Dell. Much of the capacitor plague folklore centers on Taiwanese electrolyte theft, but Dell's OptiPlex failures trace largely to Nichicon, a long-respected Japanese supplier rather than a bargain bin knockoff. Dell did not make the capacitors or brew the electrolyte. Other manufacturers, including HP and Apple, were hit by bad capacitors too. Dell's case became different because of the scale of the OptiPlex exposure and the internal documents later forced into view. To see why Dell's version cut deeper, you have to know what the OptiPlex actually was. It was the company's business desktop, the safe, boring box sold by the thousands to hospitals, law firms, school districts, government offices, and Fortune 500 companies. People bought OptiPlex machines on a single promise, that the thing would sit under a desk and just work. The hardest-hit models were the GX270, the GX280, and the small SX270 built across 2003, 2004, and 2005. At first, Dell did what its support line did and pointed the finger outward. When the math department at the University of Texas reported their desktops failing, the company suggested the machines had simply been driven too hard by heavy computation. Meanwhile, a web hosting company called Advanced Internet Technologies, or AIT, was watching more than 2,000 OptiPlex systems fail in waves, machines it had put to work inside its hosting business. The trouble with the official explanation was the boards themselves, which kept failing the same way, no matter who owned them or what they were running. Studies by Dell and an outside firm flagged 11.8 million computers shipped between May of 2003 and July of 2005 as at risk of failure. For its SX270 and GX270 systems, Dell's own 3-year failure estimate climbed from about 12% in mid-2004 to 45% just months later, with the worst case as high as 97%. That number was a projection buried in Dell's own documents, not a count of dead machines. But it tells you what the company's own people believed they were staring at. And Dell continued shipping affected OptiPlex systems during the period identified in those documents. With numbers like that in hand, the obvious move would be a public recall. Dell chose something quieter. There was no broad recall of the OptiPlex line, and in its place, the company offered what it called proactive field replacements and stretched warranties, swapping boards for customers who crossed a certain threshold of failures or fit the right purchase profile. The documents that surfaced later show how the rest were handled. According to internal presentations described by the New York Times, employees were told to emphasize uncertainty when a customer asked what was wrong. One email from December of 2004, reported by CNN Money, has a Dell project manager questioning why a particular customer had ever been told about a GX270 board issue when they had only seen 2 failures so far. The preferred move, in plain terms, was to say nothing. The whole approach was built to keep every failure looking local. One of those affected customers was the New York law firm Simpson, Thacher & Bartlett. It was regarding their failing machines that a Dell project manager wrote the exact line that would define the entire cover-up. We need to avoid all language indicating the boards were bad or had issues. A firm watching machines fail in batches heard it was their power or their server room, and a hospital seeing workstations reboot mid-shift was told to check its outlets. As long as nobody connected the dots in writing, each customer fought the problem alone and paid for the downtime Dell's own studies had predicted. For its part, Dell has always maintained that it never knowingly shipped boards it knew were bad, and that it widened warranty coverage as the picture cleared. Those are the company's words. The documents are something else. A paper trail like that stays buried unless a customer forces it open. That customer was AIT. What caught their attention wasn't only the failures. It was that Dell's own technicians kept swapping the dead boards for replacement boards carrying the very same bulging capacitors, and those replacements failed too. So AIT sued. The case landed in November of 2007, claiming breach of contract, fraud, and deceptive business practices. Over 3 years of fighting, the company's lawyers pried loose Dell's internal failure studies, emails, and slide decks, and a judge ordered much of it unsealed. In 2010, the New York Times published a detailed report on those documents, and the heat and dust story didn't just weaken, it collapsed inside Dell's own files. Some of the numbers in those files were never projections at all. Back in 2005, Dell had already taken a $300 million charge to deal with the failing boards. Later accounting showed the company replaced motherboards in about 22% of 21 million OptiPlex systems. Somewhere near 4.6 million machines actually pulled apart and repaired. The lawsuit itself ended quietly, and the verdict was never really the point. The documents were the point, and they were out in the open. If you spent the mid-2000s swapping dead OptiPlex boards and being told to check the room, the outlet, or the workload, the documents changed what that answer meant. Heat may have stressed the machines. Dust may have complicated repairs. But inside Dell, the failing boards had already become a known, documented pattern. While official support scripts continued to point toward environmental factors, the undeniable physical evidence was steadily swelling up right on the motherboard.